record it. Yan. Tapos, I guess let's start with the what was Okay, sige. So we're recording na. So Steph, and also kung may guest tayo. So I can see one. Tapos Zoom. Yan. So yun, so medyo interesting yung interesting tong episode na to kasi it's not going to be our regular kwentuhan session. So I mentioned if for those who are viewing this live and also those who will view this on the recorded format. So the para tong parang segment, parang new segment ng Photography Chismis Kwentuhan Sessions, in a way that it's under the Marites Talks because the format tonight will be a bit different. So in our sige, ito yung introductory text natin So let's start. Okay, so why are we here? Yeah, so why are we here? So so I'll just read the introductory text. So in the aim to promote discourse, we are opening the podcast to commentaries, counterarguments, dissenting opinions, and extensions of previously presented content. Tonight, we have writer, artist, and curator Stephanie Frondoso responding to the episode Introduction to Photography Trends. If you've been following the podcast, that channel, the last content that we uploaded is Introduction to Photography Trends. So most of the responses that Stephanie will be doing tonight is specifically in relation to Introduction to Photography Trends, the last episode that I uploaded. So welcome to Marites Talks, Counterpoints. Tonight we have Stephanie Frondoso responding to Introduction to Photography Trends. The format will be a bit different. So it's going to be 10 to 15 minutes uninterrupted exposition. Then we talk about it afterwards. So para hindi natin i-interrupt si Steph. Okay. Tapos siguro mabilis lang sigurong reminders. So I'll just flash the reminders and notices for our audiences and also for participants. So a little bit of formality. Okay. So just a reminder. So first, this is a recorded Zoom session. You will be prompted by Zoom for your consent in recording of this material. So I think for our current participants, you've been prompted naman na that we're going to record this session. And then next would be the recording shall be uploaded to Photography Chismis PH and its various platforms such as, but is not limited to, Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify for educational purposes in the aim of contributing to the discourse of photography in the Philippines. Yes, big words. This episode of the Kwentuhan Session shall not be monetized, so derived knowledge from this program should be cited accordingly based on the conventions and laws on intellectual property in the Philippines as applicable. And then lastly, this Kwentuhan Session is an informal discussion and is not a lecture. Comments and questions shall be recognized accordingly by the host and moderator as applicable. But as mentioned a while ago, the format today would be a bit different. So it's 10 minutes to 15 minutes na uninterrupted exposition by our guest. And then from there, I respond. So, I mean, we talk. That's right. Ako naman counter-response. Ayan. Okay, so that's Photography Chismis. So this is Counterpoint with Stephanie Frondoso. So, yan. So,
All right.
Steph, I turn over the floor to you.
Thank you for inviting me, Tony. I'm very excited that there are students studying photography trends. And I thought that because this is a casual discussion, I could start with just listing some of my favorite trends in photography. I mean, there are hundreds, but it might excite your students and anyone else who will end up listening to this podcast. Yeah, maybe for 2 minutes. One of my favorites is AI in photography. And locally, I'm always going to point out someone using it locally, Jake Versosa and Corinne de San Jose, who uses AI as a tool, but which is completely different from in the photograph. My second favorite trend is the maybe improving smartphone technology with better features and apps. AG de Mesa was just telling me that he uses the Nomo app for fun. And then, Oppo launched improved features for portraits, and definitely one of the trends. Number three is the return of analog and film photography, like Jovel Lorenzo, who uses the box camera, or Dwight Lu, who doesn't use Photoshop at all or scanning at all. He just manipulates in the darkroom. Herb, who uses Polaroid. Other vintage equipment coming back, pinhole cameras like Gary Ross Pastrana, ESL Chen. And so analog materials have been recast with renewed cultural relevance. And that's a very exciting trend. Number four, the rise again of experimental photography and alternative techniques. Reina Abella, Neil Oshima, Angela Silva, Corinne de San Jose, Pinky Ormaza, Dar San Agustin are all using these kinds of techniques. And even if these historical processes are being used, they are reanimated with today's intentions. The intentions have changed with the use. There are whole entire festivals dedicated to experimental photo, like Experimental Photo Festival in Barcelona. And then another favorite is historical techniques, pre-photography techniques, like anthotypes and chlorophyll prints, are now being used as sustainable photography. And Tony and I are going to have a whole other episode on that, because that is my practice, actually. But there are others in the Philippines, like Dines Victoria. She develops with caffeinol, which is essentially coffee plus vitamin C. And everywhere else, they develop with seaweed. They just, do away with toxic chemicals, which, again, later on, it'll be discussed. Some of the narratives, environmentalism, taking beautiful photos of nature is sort of counterintuitive with then polluting nature with chemicals. Photography exists in different forms beyond the framed print, like photo books. And so art historian George Baker defined in 2005 the expanded field of photography. I'm very interested in that trend. Printing objects like Angela Silva, Zian Cabanges. I took Tony to a show where he printed transfers on cement. Drone photography. I'm a cyclist and I like to have my drone follow me sometimes. I also like the beach. I like to take drone photographs of the beach. Also, snapshots and found photographs and archives used for installation. Like MMU's photographs seem like snapshots, but she turns them into these installations using wood and video. Ilan took snapshots on the street, printed them on plates, and turned it into an installation. This is in the Living Pictures exhibition in Singapore right now. And Stephanie Sihuko, who uses, I suppose, she uses her hands to cover archival photos and that is her way of rewriting how photos were used for colonial purposes. And then there are innovative use of light boxes like Poklong Anading, Zian Cabanges, conceptual photography, which I think Tony practices a lot, where the idea is more important than mastery of craft. And I also like post photography, which self-proclaimed users of post photography are Wawi Navarrosa, and I think Migs Gomez, Conrado Velasco, ESL Chen, they all practice post photography, which, by the way, is still being defined right now. There is no strict definition yet of what is post photography. And then new questions on archiving, digitizing, how they are stored and conserved. There's also a trend of online photo contests and exhibitions, photo festivals, older ones like ARL, but also newer ones like Photomoto, which then leads us to vernacular photography, which was what Tony was mainly talking about in his podcast. Vernacular photography, not just as a practice, but as it's actually a collectible now, being collected through auction houses, presented in museum exhibitions as important photography that needs to be included in the canon of art history and the history of photography. There are academic studies on the subject of vernacular photography. And some of the biggest exhibitions, like the Metropolitan Museum, had one titled Other Pictures, Vernacular Photographs from the Thomas Walter Collection, celebrating photographer unknown, because many of these found photographs were just taken by ordinary citizens, amateurs, and we don't know who took them. And living pictures, Dinle used found photographs to make an installation. So bits of vernacular photography are being included, but these trends are not just the modes of photography, but also the photographic narratives, which some of the trending narratives are queer narratives, systemic racism, how to rewrite how the colonizers used photography, marginalized voices, identity within society, climate change. These are some trends that are on the narrative and not just the mode of photography. Also, trends on how photographic exhibitions are curated. There are surveys like pictures and not visual noise, but there are also hybrids like photomoto. Tony and I are actually working on an exciting curatorial proposal, which I am not going to reveal right now. But yeah, that would be an exciting exhibition someday. There are thematic exhibitions like Don't, Photography and the Art of Mistakes. It explores how photographic techniques like double exposure, lens flare, motion blur, deemed as errors by one generation of photographers, became an interesting aesthetic intention by the next generation of photographers. That's a really, really interesting exhibition. Or even one called Snap Plus Share, transmitting photographs from mail art to social networks. That explores how photography was transmitted first via the mail, leading up all the way to how they are shared now on social media. So those are my favorites. If you notice, I did not mention any trends in commercial photography, fashion photography, and photojournalism, simply because I am not in that field. But I just mentioned so many that I think are so exciting. Now, going to vernacular photography. I guess as an introduction, it should be defined. And the definition is, it's an umbrella term used to distinguish fine art photographs from those made by non-artists for a huge range of purposes: scientific, governmental, personal, snapshots capturing everyday life. In fact, some curators and thinkers will claim that photography is, in essence, a vernacular medium. Some of the examples not mentioned by Tony were ID photos for passports, driver's license, school IDs, which is taken at the PhotoMe booth. Mugshots, which I think Tony vaguely mentioned police reports, so that's probably it. And forensic shots, so used by the police. Class group photos, when you're standing in rows for the class, that's vernacular photography. Digital microscope photographs, photocopies, the Xerox machine, that's essentially a photograph. Scans, including x-rays, brain scans, dentist x-rays, security surveillance photos, satellite photos like Google Earth, telescope pictures of outer space, and what Tony mostly mentioned were family photos and personal photos taken through smartphones. But as you can see, vernacular photography, there are many kinds. They're used in sciences and even beyond the smartphones. So there are also millions of Filipinos who are doctors, dentists, lab technicians, who do the photocopying and all that. And the ones used for science they're definitely important. They save lives, they improve health. The ones used for security, they protect people, they protect property, and they're important. They're not meaningless. They're still important in other ways. There was a big focus on the memes, but there's actually a lot more. Now, in fact, the earliest vernacular photographs, the framed tintype miniature portraits used for personal keepsakes, would fall under vernacular photography, as well as the first daguerreotypes, or Victorian photography, which has the hidden mother, Victorian photography where they included a deceased family member in the family photo, and they would draw eyes so that the deceased member looks alive or the eyes are open. So of all these types of vernacular photography I mentioned, then it leads to certain trends, especially in art, like J.C. Jacinto, here in the Philippines. He used the digital microscope to create artworks. Nona Garcia uses X-rays, also Jason Kibilan. Manny Montelibono uses infrared. Facial recognition software, that's just used by a lot of people. And then Derek Tumala uses a telescope. Well, during his residency at the Manila Observatory, he used photos taken by telescopes, but also archival photos as well from scientists working at the Manila Observatory. So photography is important because it contributes to developments in the sciences. Besides recording history and disseminating news and information, it's also used in education. So I grew up with a photocopier because when I was going to school, we had no books. We had to photocopy everything. So that, for me, that's a big thing in education in the third world countries. And used for all kinds of research, especially research studying society. So camera photography in contemporary culture, a big thing discussed by Tony. The memes, which, yes, are in the Philippines, but also worldwide, like the sign guy. I'm sure everybody knows the sign guy. Every time anything happens, like maybe the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp trial, a whole bunch of memes are going to come up. Or when Bernie Sanders was photographed asleep, there were a gazillion memes and everyone commented on everything, including the knitted scarf he was wearing. So memes is in the Philippines and everywhere. But that's also because the Philippines is connected to the rest of the world via the internet. So, it's not insular. One of the other issues with camera photography, aside from studying cultural attitudes, is also number 2, authorship. You post something on Instagram, there's a contract that says that photo is not anymore owned by you. And second, if you take a screenshot of a photo, who is the author now? You, because you took the screenshot of the photo, or still the original person who took that photo? First, spreaders of phones add to the spreading of fake news. But also, beyond issues of democracy, we are in this era of post-truth, which becomes a problem for historians of the future. How are they going to piece together what is real and what is fake? I really pity them. But camera photography also, there's this self-image consciousness that leads to the breakdown of mental health and things happening like fat shaming, ideas of going viral, which photographs before would not go viral, new terms like trolling. I'm trolling your photos and I'm trolling you on Instagram, checking out your photos, trolling you. And then also camera phone photo, it's used for activism, but also the rise of the hyper woke and cancel culture. And algorithms application of photography, corporate data mining to monetize social media platforms. In fact, the other day, Tonya and I were just talking about Descartes, and then he got sent all these, I don't know, things about Descartes. These are all the issues under that come up with camera photography in contemporary culture. It's a lot. So now, leading to photography and modern art, Tony was discussing. He sent me writings as well. This was definitely a two-way relationship. Photography helped give rise to modern art, but they influenced each other. Okay, I'm just gonna say two examples of how they influenced each other. Photography actually freed painting from the shackles of realistic rendering. And so painters were able to explore emotions, the subconscious. But of course, now we know that photography can do that as well. Photography can also explore emotions and the subconscious. But painting influenced photographic techniques like autochrome came about because they liked how colorful impressionist paintings were, or tableau photography is based on the principles of tableau painting. It was a two-way relationship. But beyond that, though, including vernacular photography in the conversation of art history is another way of rethinking modernism. Usually we talk about modernism through the great white masters like Moholy-Nagy, Man Ray, Rodchenko, Impressionist masters. But we can rethink that notion of modernism as just taking place in the European avant-garde. It also circulated in hobbyist photo clubs and other amateur work during that period. Photography was just a fraction of the impetus of the rise of modern art. Also, historical events, philosophies, ideologies, science, and literature that were all happening in that era led to modern art. And as a side comment, example, just to clarify to, to people who don't study art history, when Impressionism came about, it was because paints were finally in tubes. Before they had to mix pigments, it was really messy. But when the paint tubes came about, finally painters could paint in plein air, which is outdoor. Realism came about during the French Revolution, when suddenly artists denounced bourgeois portraiture and they wanted to paint workers and the masses doing ordinary things. And Expressionism, because of the writings of Freud on the subconscious, also abstraction and cubism from physics, like Einstein's theory of relativity. I suppose what I'm trying to say is there were many other factors, not just photography, but this is related to the subject of legitimization, which is nice because Tony's goal is to legitimize photography in the Philippines. The Impressionists had to present their work in tents outside the Louvre because the Academy did not consider their work art. And in fact, all the museum curators at that time who acquired Impressionist paintings were fired. So the same thing happened with the realists. And eventually, it happened with the realists because people were saying, oh, those are just paintings of workers doing ordinary things, wearing worker clothes. That's not art. That's not beautiful. So there were these changing definitions of beauty. However, now Impressionism and Realism are firmly in the canon. And I think the same will happen to photography. It's a matter of time, especially if we continue dialogues like what Tony's doing. Now I'm heading towards the last part. Tony was clarifying that he must be careful when he speaks about abstract art, which is nice because abstract art didn't just begin with the modern, during modernity. It began with the cave paintings. Cave paintings are essentially abstracted. They're not realistic. They're like stick figures almost, which are symbols. They eventually led to the creation of the written language. So Egyptian hieroglyphics, Chinese characters, they are pictures that were simplified. And but yet then again, these abstract symbols are what unifies all of us. They're universally understood no matter what language we speak. For example, the smiley face, everyone around the world knows that that means happy. And the heart symbol, it doesn't look like the heart organ at all. It's the heart symbol is universally recognized as love, or now in the era of Instagram, likes. If you press heart, that means you like the photo. So as you can see, cave paintings, abstract, is related to Instagram likes. There is a thread in all these centuries of history, how people respond to photography. Now, my conclusion, when we study photography, it must be in relation not only to art history, but also to world history, philosophy, metaphysics, the history of science, sociology, anthropology, literature. And when you read writings and texts, you must still approach them with a critical mind, analyzing what is beyond the text. Because everyone is infallible and every piece is a part of a bigger puzzle as we try to deconstruct the canons of history that have been written clearly as, colonial or heteropatriarchal. And you might tell me, oh no, I did not spend years studying philosophy and anthropology. How's that? Well, never mind. I'm going to give you a little shortcut. Aside from reading books, it's true that very few Filipinos go to museums and galleries. But as students of photography, I really strongly urge you to visit even online, even on the museum website, these major photography exhibitions, because many experts and researchers have spent years collaborating to come up with an exhibition to concretize these ideas and to present them in a public-friendly way. Museum wall text is meant to be understood to as young as 15 years old. So college can definitely understand. And if you want a shortcut because you don't have years to study philosophy and everything else, yeah, that's one way that I would say you can do that. It's very interesting. There's a lot of visuals and it's a fun way to learn. So that's all, Tony.
Yun. So So thank you, Stefa. So kung if you just joined us or you're watching this, siguro nag-start if you're watching this or listening to this on the podcast format na, regardless if it's in YouTube or Spotify. So that entire around 10 minutes that Stephanie was talking. So this episode is a bit different in the sense that the format is different because this is parang experimental episode on counterpoints. So the idea is that photography chismis is opening the floor for counter arguments, reactions, commentaries, dissenting opinions if ever kung meron man on existing content. So parang since discourse, the idea of discourse in its heart is conversations and also an exchange of knowledge. So the idea is this specific format that you're you're experiencing right now, whether in podcast form or live na nandito. Stephanie was specifically responding to the episode introduction to photography trends. Yun. So para lang alam niyo kung saan nagagaling yung most of the response ni Steph. So we're also doing this para yun nga, parang nangyayari hindi lang isa yung nagsasalita. Kasi discourse, pag nanggaling lang sa isang source, that is actually, what's the word for it? Ano yun? Ano bang term doon, Steph? Parang hindi siya democratic or parang may term doon sa academic studies na kung isa lang nagsasalita. Anyway, so I'll figure it out. Hindi siya discourse.
It's not a discourse, and that will be, because photography is essentially about plurality and diversity. So it's many voices who are involved in photography. So it makes sense.
Ayun, tapos pala. Ayun, so now since na tapos na yung kay Steph, siguro add ko na lang din. So that episode, the introduction to photography trends, that is actually a recording of my class. So in Benilde, so I teach a theory class in Benilde to support the practical subjects kasi kadalasan when we talk about photography lalo na doon sa mga manonood ng podcast na to. Just also similarly, I mentioned this yesterday during my talk sa Photo World Asia, that most people think of photography as the production of an image, when in fact a lot of photography, a huge part of photography, is in the consumption. So I'm highlighting that in also my class that you have to understand photography in a broader sense, that kaya rin na-introduce yung idea ng vernacular, and specifically the part that I uploaded is yun, kaya rin sabi ni Steph na parang ang laki nung part nung last episode about trying to contextualize vernacular photography since hindi siya masyado na pag-uusapan. So yun yung So if you watch, so guys, kung mapanood niyo yung previous episode, kaya medyo siya, I think in our conversations kami din ni Steph, inunahan ko na rin si Steph na before this episode na siya, it's really reductive in the sense that there are a lot of general statements made about cultural trends and photography trends and conceptions about democracy, vernacular photography. Because it was just basically parang 28 minutes of an entire subject that I teach. So it's a 14 week subject, 3 hours each. So that means that's around 42 hours. So basically yung 42 hours ng class ko, parang I had to give yung na-upload. That's basically around 28 minutes. So sobrang ang dami talagang dinaanan lang. So yung to give context on dun sa mga viewers. So kung gusto niyo makita talaga yung the entire exposition, I sent also kay Steph yung the entire syllabus. So makikita niya rin doon na yung how it was contextualized, the idea of a trend. And from there, my students are introduced to things that are outside the practical subjects. So kadalasan kasi when we talk about photography, it's fashion photography, commercial photography, documentary photography, when in fact there's a lot of things din. Siguro Steph, siguro parang a response ko din doon siguro doon sa doon sa 10 points mo. One of the things that I noticed, I think even before also we started recording, we were talking about parang photography could be, I mean, in my case, when I talk about photography, parang since ang background ko is communication arts, most of the way I speak about photography, it's in terms of as a communicative language, or at least the community or mediatic, or I mean, I see it as a medium. So I think na-mention ko prior to recording is that when kadalasan outside class kasi yung pag nag-class na kami meron ng specific na parang framework, pero outside class my initial approach to photography is that I'm a bit skeptical on on the assignation or designation of photography as an art form. So parang similarly, for example, you mentioned a while ago that symbolic representation as part of the human psyche when you mentioned, diba, yung the cave drawings. So in a way, parang for you, when you start talking about symbolic representation, you already have an assignation or designation of it na parang it's an artistic expression of the human psyche. Sa communication arts naman ng framework, the way we frame it is that the art actually is contingent. Parang the idea of art in a way is contingent to, ang priority muna at that time was for someone to communicate. So I think yun yung I think parang in a way, parang that's a good example of us talking about the same thing, pero the framing is a bit different. So
Very. For
yeah.
us, if it's a drawing, it's art. It's a drawing. It's art already. So yeah, it's super different. I guess we come from very different points of view. But I guess what really made me tell Tony, hey, your introduction, it's so incomplete, when he sent me a message saying, here, I've explained vernacular photography. And I realized, but there's so much kulang.
Sobrang
But what
kulang.
sciences? And what about the eye and the photocopying and everything else? So not just the phone photo. So there's so many others. So I thought the students would yeah, the common, yeah.
So yun, so siguro if you're listening din dito, so one of the things that we also when we do our class, we also explain that one thing in the phenomenology of photography. I mean, yun din, meron din kaming, we also talk about phenomenology na parang an overview of phenomenology. Actually, I also talked about this yesterday sa Photo World Asia. Parang nag-goal sila, parang, dati camera lang pinag-usapan natin, ngayon philosophy na, diba? So parang medyo bago. So in a way, as Steph mentioned, I have this advocacy to bring out, parang, di ba bring out, parang masyado na messianic yung dating, na parang, I just want to parang offer, offer parang another point of view of photography na outside the conception of art, in the sense that photography can be a philosophy. Like for example, Steph also knows na in February 11, there's going to be Dr. Barbasa from the Ateneo, yung former chair ng Ateneo philosophy department, and he's going to talk about photography as a philosophy. So in a way, when you contextualize photography as a philosophy, the idea of artistic expression, artistic ambition, expression, suddenly you get to bracket that for a moment, that when you look at a photograph, it's actually phenomenology, wherein aesthetics is not parang it's contingent to that framing. So yun yung, tapos similarly in this case, when I talk about photography, I mean, kaya nga ngayon nangyayari parang if you talk about photography, you have to say muna na where you're coming from. That's one thing that I noticed, na I also highlighted sa talk ko sa Photomoto, na parang we could be talking about the same thing, we're using the same terms, we're using the same language, and yet we don't understand each other. Parang ganon. So kaya we open this segment of photography chismis, na probably if you're a documentary photographer, siguro kung nandito si Jess, baka iba rin yung point of view niya, kasi last night din we were chatting about photography. Sabi niya, ano yan, dapat it should be, I mean, di man should, pero yung framing ng photography niya, it's about Marxism, in the sense that it's material, parang material dialectics. So yun yung namang framing niya. So in a way, parang sa kanya contingent ang art fair PH, and yung categories of photography as art and photography as documentary, for him parang contingent siya to the framing of photography as a Marxist materialist ideology. So parang nangyayari, parang secondary yung conceptions of art, 'di ba? So yun yung sinasabi ko rin, siguro tawag dito, Steph, na baka
but we're actually talking about the same thing, because when we look at the photograph and read it, we're reading it like a painting. For example, he posts a photo of some photojournalist photo, like war or something. As somebody who reads art, we're still going to read it like a painting. What is this subject? What is it about? What is the intention of the maker? What are they trying to communicate? So there's no separate. It's the philosophy is embedded. It's not a separate thing. So that's why we seem to be talking about the same things, but the approach is different. Like, it's not just exist in the world of photojournalism. I mean, someone who reads paintings would read it the same. What is the form? What is the purpose of the light being here, or not, or it's just a plain photo. So it's read like a painting, which comes naturally to.
Galing, galing. Kasi nag-usap kami ni Dr. Barbasa para doon sa episode niya. He was saying na when yung talk niya kasi, parang tinanong ko, anong framework? Yun yung una kong tanong yung una kong tanong is, ano yung magiging framework nung philosophy of photography? And he was saying na he is going to use specifically Heideggerian phenomenology. So yung Heideggerian baka ma-preempt. Pero ang point lang nun, yung framing niya is Heideggerian phenomenology. So the conversation when you read a photograph, it's anyway in a way parang medyo parang kasi 'di ba yung kay Heidegger, yung the idea of the sign, the same, yung diba yung the sign, the idea of being there, parang yun, or things in themselves. Yun yung philosophy nun. So when we're going to read the photograph of something on February 11, walang aesthetics in the sense na paano yung lighting, what does it mean, 'di ba? Parang is the configuration parang is the color I mean in color theory, how is it, 'di ba? Parang ganun na parang yung formalist idea of the image, in a way parang it's bracketed na sige, let's look at a photograph in terms of what does it say about the human person. Parang nagiging ganun yung kaya ngayon tuwing meron akong kausap na for a new episode, I always ask, ano bang framing natin? Sa February 2, ang framing naman is vernacular photography in terms of memes, specifically memes, as an intervention of space. so yun naman yung mangyayari. Pero nevertheless, siguro to move this conversation forward. So in a way parang we agree, Steph, na na siguro one of the things that we can make discourses about photography more productive is that probably at the start of a conversation, we provide parang a context on how we're going to converse. Na in the same way na siguro pa nag-uusap tayo, do we talk in Taglish? Do we talk in French? Do we talk about it in German? Because the language that we use probably is for a French, yung sabihin natin yung sun is called soleil, tama ba? Yung sun is soleil o sol, 'di ba? Pero sa atin araw, tapos ang English is sun. Pero in a way parang nagtatalo tayo. I mean, hindi man nagtatalo. Parang in a way parang we're talking about the same thing, but the framing, the language that we're using could be different. So siguro one of the outcomes of this conversation, no? Tapos maliban pa doon, siguro tatanong ko rin pala to, tanong ko rin Steph. Napansin ko with the assumption with this agreement that in a way when we read photographs, we have to parang more or less parang merong parang need to say na parang I'm speaking about a photograph in terms of this framing. So, given that there are different framings, would that mean that each field of study becomes a process of appropriation? I mean, in a way, for example, for me, if I say na the ideogram, kasi diba kanina example mo yung cave drawings, or for example, the smile, the like, diba? The like button, the smiley emoji, the heart emoji, these are basically ideograms. Basically, you have a conception of an idea, and then there's a visual representation of that idea as an ideogram that in a way people can relate to, similar to a cave drawing of of a head na stick na parang this is supposed to be representative of a human person, 'di ba? The cave drawing or a bison, 'di ba? Or any kind of cave drawing. So in a way it's an ideogram. So in a way my terminologies ko rin. For example, the ideogram, kadalasan that term is used in communication arts and visual communication studies. So for an artist, it's basically representative art or symbolic representative art, diba? So in a way, parang we're talking about the same thing pero we're using
Yeah.
the term naman. So
Absolutely.
siguro yung yung question ko would be so basically in a way ba this process is a process of appropriation? I mean that this entire framing thing.
How do you define appropriation?
In a way that for example if for example if I'm in the field of philosophy and I use photography as an area of study, in a way I'm appropriating an existing object, a photograph, a thing in the world. Naku, parang ganyan, parang na-advance yung talk namin ni Dr. Barbasa. Pero in a way parang it becomes parang something outside us, an object, a symbol, our drawing, a scratch, a sound. Kasi sabihin natin, pwedeng music, diba? Pero specifically photography muna. If that is the case, so is reality some sort of appropriation? Parang yun yung, parang if I stretch the idea na, parang the reality exists. And then, when we read things, we are coming from implied in the reading or in the consumption of something in the world. We're framing it and I think parang siguro for me parang that's in a way appropriating something to how we make sense of that thing in the world. So tama ko yun.
Oh, well, I wouldn't use the word appropriate, but I would say the clearest way to explain it is that when you look at a photograph or any artwork, because I still firmly believe a photograph is an artwork, there's going to be multiple readings depending on the multiple every human is individual. Everyone from a kid is going to see something different and is going to react differently to someone who is deeply educated in the arts. But all the readings, whether you're a kid, whether you're walk in the museum, are valid. Are valid. So it's just because of being human and we are all unique. We're going to see something different in the picture. So somebody takes a photograph of Starry Night, somebody takes a photograph of a war, will say, what period of history was this taken? What was happening culturally, sociologically, the culture breakdown at the time. So, or a kid might see that totally differently. Like, what is happening? So all readings are valid.
Yan, actually yan. So yun yung yun yung answer mo. Diyan ako actually yun yung iniisip ko nga ngayon na kasi one of the major concerns in the hindi naman major concerns pero one field of study in the academe or in art history or art criticism is that we can never arrive at a single truth. And that is, I mean, siguro for if framed in the artistic lens, if frame things like any reading is valid. So parang yun yung sabi mo, diba? Any reading is valid. So in a way, parang we're going, parang it resonates towards that idea of the postmodernist condition that, diba, based on the postmodernist condition is that every truth is real and is valid. So parang am I interpolating yung idea mo correctly?
No, valid not as true, but valid as if that is your if a kid sees it that way, what is the real definition of valid? I'm not equating it to truth though. Meaning that's an acceptable reaction. Okay, the kid looks at a picture of a cloud. Oh, I see a cow. Okay, that's a valid reaction. It's not like you're wrong, something like that. But yeah, whether there are multiple truths, that's super arguable that there is a universal truth. Many philosophers are going to argue for or against that, because saying that there are multiple truths is like saying everything changes, which, as we all know, it's a fallacy. Because if you say the word everything changes, even that statement will change. So there cannot be multiple truths. So again, oh no, like a whole bunch of people with a whole different philosophies are going to argue any which way and consider it fallacies. But um to simplify it, any reading of a photograph, I would say, is acceptable. You're approaching it from historical point of view, from art appreciation, from the ideology behind it, the subconscious. It's fine.
So yung ganun kasi parang yun din yun eh. I think even that, even even this even this idea that, I mean, even your framing, even the framing that you're using, that is actually parang we also discussed that in class as the I think you mentioned it already a while ago, yung post-truths na the idea of the cultural trend of the post-truths, in the sense that for now, parang kasi parang ngayon, parang you have to identify what is truth, what is fact, 'di ba? What is perspective, yung perspectivalism. All of these are actually parang yan. So, ayun, we were also talking about this before we started our conversation. So, yun. Even that idea of the postmodern, kasi that answer that you said, the idea of any reading could be valid, pero you ask what does it mean when you say valid? So I guess, I mean, valid in logic, basically valid means it's not necessarily true or false, but it is assumed that it can stand on its own. Parang it is a parang it's a self-coherent parang affirmation of something. Yeah. So yun yung
Yeah, it's part of democracy and what we were talking about cancel culture.
oh. So yun.
Yeah, there's no one, yeah.
So yun, so yung idea kasi na yun, for example, that statement, that was only recognized around 19 na mga early 1900s, because prior to that, modernity as a cultural trend, modernity, for example, if you go Kantian, diba? So if you go yung positivistic ideas of the church and science and all of those things during the modern times, I mean that modern era, na notice ko na even the statements that we make right now, na parang something can exist in the real world as is, but we look at it differently through our perspective. That idea of perspectivalism, that the truth is based on a perspective, that only happened around 1800s, 18 to 1900s. Prior to that, if you go to Kant, o sabihin natin we go to Greece na lang. Sabihin natin kung since both of us are parang 'di ba, I mean we're heavy on the humanities. Even for example yung kay Plato na parang the forms, yun, 'di ba, yung sabi niya, the realm of the forms. In a way, parang Plato was saying that a form exists even without us. Parang the forms are defined, kaya nga sila forms. There's a certain factitude of reality that even without our perspective exists already. Kaya yun yung idea of the Platonic forms, di ba? So ibig sabihin nun, parang ang nangyayari ngayon, that idea of that there's one form of a certain thing that even if we look at it in different perspectives is still the same thing. that has been challenged by postmodernism. And in a way, tayong dalawa tayo mismo as educators and artists, that parang in a way, parang that points to that truth, di ba? Na parang there is something that exists in the real world, like a cave drawing, and then we're reading it differently.
Yeah. I read it as a drawing as art, but you're reading it as a form of communication, which I think is both, because art is supposed to communicate.
So yun. So yun, siguro for kung mayroon man akong estudyante na mag-join dito, that's an exact, parang that's a clear example of a reality, a phenomena that is happening from 1800s to the 2023 that didn't used to happen. Na parang the idea of, sabihin natin sila Immanuel Kant, yung mga philosophers before, was that there's one truth. And everyone is moving towards that truth. So I think in my last podcast, then we talked about Hegel. Hegel was saying that as we develop as a human species, we are moving closer to the Geist, di ba? Merong term si Hegel na the Geist, that the final truth. So parang if that is the case, yun yung sinasabi ni Hegel, then now that we're in 2023 and we're having this counterpoint podcast, then that means Hegel was wrong, because how come after Hegel ang daming truth instead of us having, since Hegel already mentioned that we are moving towards the Geist, which is the ultimate truth of humanity. Hindi siya individual people, as a human race, we should be moving towards that. And yet, even ngayon, Steph and I would have to accommodate each other's ideas. For example, if sabihin natin, if we contextualize our conversation in the artistic framing, I would agree that the cave drawings are the primordial expressions of human artistry. I can phrase it that way, di ba? So, pero
Yeah.
that means I am accommodating a perspective or a framing that is a little bit different from the way media studies or communication arts frames it. So parang, 'di ba? That's quite interesting and siguro pag bringingin pa natin si Dr. Barbasa, sabihin niya na probably a photograph is basically traces of human forms. And it is not necessarily aesthetics. It's not in the field of aesthetics. It's in the field of phenomenology. No, so parang ang daming perspectives na, 'di ba? So ayun, and that's the point of counterpoints, that we're opening the floor to a different, not necessarily different. Well, kasi yun nga, parang we're in a way, parang we're saying that these are opposing ideas. Siguro na lang, we're not saying distinct ideas are not necessarily oppositions. We're just saying, diba? So, mas magandang phrasing siguro yun na.
Because there could be a universal truth. It's just that people are looking at it from different angles.
So maganda rin. Parang kaya rin when I give talks, I always, parang I start with, na for me, photography is phenomenology, na whether I frame it as art, whether I frame it as communication tool, whether I frame it as science. Kasi, kanina rin, diba, Steph, we were saying that historically, photography was a scientific experiment.
Yes.
So if we, parang basically it's chemistry, diba? So
yeah, the naturalists of the past, they were photographers and scientists. There was no distinction. And yeah, we're gonna discuss that in length at our next one, sustainable photography.
Sige. So it's 8:03 siguro, to manage lang din kasi I think since dalawa lang naman tayo, siguro we target siguro 8:30 para din is it okay to you? So yun. Tapos so if in case may questions from the floor, si Angela and si Miss Claudine. So if you have questions, let me know. Ay, yun, meron pala si Angela. So so Steph, nakikita mo Angela Silva is.
Yeah. Hi, Angela. Angela, you actually figured in my, I don't know if you were there from the very beginning, but I used you as an example for two things. Cyanotypes, which is an alternative process, and I also used you as an example for different modes of photography, meaning printing on objects.
Oh,
Yeah.
hi.
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 Actually, I'm not doing video or because I might be very
Ako pudol.
You.
my internet connection was bad in and out, so I was kicked out and then I tried to keep coming back in. Thanks, Steph. I do have a question because it was the first time I'd actually been curated into a photography show
Mhm.
with my only experience in my short exhibiting, career in the fine art, like the gallery or the art fair, arena. So I was learning a lot how photography is a medium. I was also learning how my works, the cyanotype, was relating to it. So I hope to follow the recording to see what Stephanie might have mentioned. I do have a question, both to you both,
Mhm.
because I think you both are really also trying to engage Anthony, your students, and learn about photography as a medium. And then for Stephanie as a curator, but also, having continuing to lead Fotomoto into future exhibitions, traveling. I have a question about how the way you both might be doing it. Anthony is an educator and Stephanie as a curator. So I started to compose a question that I'm going to read. I'm interested in the curatorial experience of Stephanie and the ways of teaching that Anthony might be using in your classes. Stephanie, as a curator of many fine art exhibitions at major galleries. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you-
yes. I can hear
Also, I've been following your recent trip to Singapore,
you.
and you viewed a major photography exhibition at the Singapore National Gallery. I'm so envious and I hope to catch up. I'm curious about the presence or absence of wall text and artist statements as a trend, Stephanie, curatorially now in many of the gallery exhibitions I've seen in Manila, compared to institutional, like museum exhibitions, where they still offer a lot of wall text. And that's my question to both of you. Do wall texts appear only in institutional exhibitions? Does it help educate viewers in gallery exhibitions? Because Anthony, that's how I met you, was the gallery exhibition of Fotomoto. So I want to read texts, wall texts and labels, because it gives me additional information after I've seen the work. But how do you both, each one of you, use it or not? And what would be the reasons why or why not?
Would you like to begin, Tony?
This is first.
Okay. I think that wall text is very important, and in my curatorial, the Sotheby's Institute in New York, it's actually practically a science where you have to distribute the wall text in a way that won't converge. You have to be able to control the flow of traffic. Yeah. In galleries in the Philippines, some have wall text, some don't have wall text. It's extremely varied. During the pandemic, especially, there was born a new method of the QR code because nobody wanted to touch anything. And, you know, galleries like Silverlands, you can read the catalog and the exhibition text if you click. You just put your camera on video, on photo mode, and photo mode. Hey, it's related to photography. You put your camera on photo mode and then you aim it at the QR code and then you get to read more about it. That is relatively recent. It came out during the pandemic. But I just realized, Tony, it's related to photography because you have to put your phone on camera mode to
Hmm.
be able to read those QR codes.
That's photography actually. So,
Yeah.
kaya yun nga eh, parang intersectional talaga yung, ay, sige, go ahead. You first and then ako.
Yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah. I just came from interviewing an artist, for example, in Sikihor, and I wrote her exhibition text, and that's going to be printed in the gallery wall at in the gallery in Dumaguete, which is called Mugna Gallery. Photomoto had exhibition text, especially the special exhibitions. Each one had, we just printed it out and put it on pedestals. So yeah, I'm one of those who think that is extremely important in whatever mode.
Yung,
Tony?
yung for me naman, actually yun, I recently wrote something about it na parang kasi there was I also included in photography chismis the idea of the the foolishness of explaining a photograph. Yan. So parang one topic that I tried to explore is one quarter of the photography community believes that if you need to explain or put writings on a photograph, then that means that your image is not strong enough to convey what it wants to convey. So that there's one view, there's one school siguro, I don't know I don't know if I should say school of thinking, or basta there's one part of the community in the Philippines. I'm trying also my best to put it, to contextualize it in the Philippines kasi walang end kung if I'm going to include the US or whatever. So I always contextualize in the Philippines. So there's one part of the community of photography practice in the Philippines that believes that regardless if you put it in the gallery system, if you put it in whatever, you shouldn't put text. And if in case you put text, it should just be very uh
Just the artwork, like
so basically,
just,
yeah.
yeah.
Actually, even that, even the title, some photographers believe that you shouldn't put title. So when you go, kasi you mentioned a while ago, Steph, there are communities, online communities, and my online exhibits. There are groups who would want their members to just submit a photo and there's no text, even the title. They wouldn't ask the title because for them, putting a title parang in a way parang influences your reading of an image, and therefore that also shows a weakness in your photograph, that the photographs they believe should be demonstrative in itself. Whatever you want to say, it should be there in the photograph. And if you need any text, even a title, that's an example of your weakness as a photographer. Parang in a way, in that view, text is a crutch for them. So it's a crutch. Okay, so that's one side of the Philippine context. Pero another side of the Philippine photography practice is that mostly in documentary and in fine arts, for documentary practice, a caption is required. It has been a practice since 2000, since the 70s or 60s, because a photograph is supplementary to a news. Diba? So one of the great traditions of Philippine photography is the photo documentary practice. And for that tradition, or for that thread of the practice, you don't need to explain a photograph, but you have to label it properly, in the sense that if something happens, I mean, kadalasan ito mga practitioners nito, they quote John Berger kasi for John Berger, he was saying that the photograph and the text has a certain relationship that is parang they support each other. So for most of the training for photographers in the Philippines, they are taught to use captions. And then the captions also should be contextualized. For a newspaper, a caption could also just be a title, but it could also be a little bit exploratory or descriptive. Pero for sabihin natin photo books that is documentary, usually it's just the title and the author. So walang explanation on what it is. Okay, now we go to fine art naman. In the fine art practice in the Philippines, since one of your goals is for people to appreciate the work, and especially right now in the contemporary context of 2007 onwards, 2000 onwards, the text is parang a supportive articulation of the works. So and in a way sa practice ng photomoto, or for example Silverlens, which I was part of before, we had to create monographs. And in the monographs, inclusive doon is the exhibition text, the explanation of the exhibit, but also an artist statement para yung perspective nung artist hindi parang untouched part yan ng gallery system. So parang nangyari, parang you have the curatorial text, which is the point of view of the exhibition, the organizers of the exhibition, but you also have the artist statements wherein you let the artist speak about his or her work. So parang gano'n. So parang nga nangyari, there's always context to so the question of how do I view text that supports an image, it should always, I mean, usually how I answer is depending on the context. If it's a gallery, which specifically, Angela, you were asking, I think it is required because in a way, the gallery system has parang it has the privilege or responsibility of articulating a work of art. So number one, because you need to historicize it, in the sense that in the practice of photography in 2023, if you have an exhibit, it historicizes the exhibition text historicizes the perspectives, the point of view, the tendencies, the motivations, all of these things cannot be fully explained in a photograph. So you have the exhibition piece. Pero maliban pa doon, the historicizing part is really to articulate that there's a certain framing to make it understandable and accessible for a viewer. Like for example, if you do conceptual art, parang there's 1,000 million ways of reading it, pero at least you will provide an access to it na hindi naman totally out of nowhere, humugot ka lang from the ether na ito yung ibig sabihin niyan, parang in a way parang at least the organizers of an exhibit and the artist, at least those two perspectives should be articulated. Their perspective should be articulated, and therefore for a viewer you have an option of ascribing or accepting or or understanding the work through that perspective of the artist and the exhibition text of the gallery. But also you can also deny. I mean, you can also you can say na no. The reason that you're writing or you're thinking about this way is that because you're coming from a perspective of male artist at the age of 45. Parang ganun, parang you can contest it in a way. Pero at least there's I think si AJ din mentioned for a critic, for example, in a way parang art critics and even galleries are moving away a little bit to a value judgment of the work. What they're trying to do is provide an access to an artwork in the sense that they cannot totally say na this is the only way to read it, but this is a starting point, parang ganun. So usually it's really based on context. So I think for the practice of the galleries, I think it's a requirement kasi you have to provide an access to the photographs. Aside from the visual dimensions, you have the textual dimension, and then siguro yung iba nga parang meron pang artist talk, 'di ba? Meron pang artist talk. So para at least para mas mahimay pa siya lalo. So yun nga para sagot ko, no? Kasi yun yung problema ko as a teacher. I have to explain lang din in the sense that there are different framings to photography, lalo na we're living in a postmodernist world na yun din yung train of thought namin kanina ni Steph, na parang in a way parang it puts a burden on a teacher or an educator or your curator that you have to, parang there's a burden of explaining. Kaya ang challenge
Yeah.
ngayon is parang how do you navigate of explaining but not necessarily becoming pedantic or parang you become parang nagiging dictatorial ka na on what you're saying. Parang ang hirap eh. So, yun yung hirap
Yeah.
ng mga curators at saka educators.
Yeah, I actually that's very, very interesting. Just last month, I was having a chat with Jerry Tan, who, you know, he's the Philippine representative of the Venice Biennale. We were together in the drawing room and we were looking at these abstract paintings, and I asked him, Jerry, what do you think about these paintings? And he said, I'd rather not say anything because if I verbalize it, it will reduce my experience of seeing it. I said, oh, and then he said, and I actually don't write about my abstract paintings. I said, you don't make an artist statement on your abstract paintings? He goes, no, because if I verbalize it, it's going to heavily reduce. Not everything can be verbalized. He was trying to tell me. And Jerry himself is a curator. It made me think a lot, but it's related to what you were saying, Tony. You know, yeah, maybe some things should be written, but in Jerry's point of view, looking at this abstract painting by talking about it, it's really reduces his thoughts and experience in seeing these forms and colors. Angela. Oh, you're muted. Okay.
Well, yeah, that's so interesting, Stephanie, because it's bringing to my head how I would be reacting or trying to support the work that I put out there, okay, in a show, because I am an exhibiting artist, for example. At the same time, I'm an avid art lover and I love to visit exhibitions. And if I can't visit physically an exhibition, even looking at it online, I will look for the monographs. I will look for the website. I will look for the statements. I will look for interviews. That's how I absorb as much as I can because I couldn't make it physically. When you tell me about this abstract artist also being a curator and not willing to make statements, I can totally understand it. But he's only one kind of genre of art. There could be other artists, maybe like myself, that I actually do plan and use the titles, the captions as part of my overall exhibition or body of work, because I believe that text will add to my visuals. Not so much that saying, like what Anthony says, like, you don't get it because you're supposed to look at it and enjoy it. No, I believe that text and captions and titles and statements can really strengthen what I'm trying to do. So if I may posit or offer to you both that artists' intentions could always be paramount, because then it can lead you to whether or not the exhibition will require a curatorial statement, artist statement, and monograph, whatever. But that conversations with the artist's intention about their body of work is so crucial. And Stephanie, if I may, I've followed your curatorial practice in your work, and your writings are so good and so strong, and I feel so disappointed when I don't get to read it at the exhibition. I have to dig for it by going into the website of the gallery. You're making it harder for me to appreciate your hard work, your fine work in writing, in your curatorial vision, in your selection of the artist, in your presentation. Why would the gallery make it hard for a viewer or art fan? I was getting very cynical. I was simply saying, oh yeah, that's because the gallery already knows that it's pre-sold the entire exhibition to their collector base, and their collector base, can be told with a phone call what it's all about, or blah, blah, blah. So that's me.
I don't think that's more sinister than what it really is. So 99.9% of galleries have exhibition text. It's just in different formats.
Okay. I'm coming to Manila again for my next round of gallery visits and for art fair, and I'll be looking for them. But meanwhile, going back to Anthony, your responsibility as an educator, and you're also your expertise. Okay, I mean, you're making us passionate about photography again with this podcast. Is how to appreciate photography in the Philippines, contemporary photography in the Philippines now, which is great because you're opening up the discourse. When you just simply say that an image should stand on its own, again, I challenge you and say certain types of genres. The photojournalism or the street photography could use a caption because of maybe context, time, place. The fine art photography, which may go into more, personal visions or whatever, may not need it, may not even need a title. But I would still like both of you to help guide us, viewers, through the appreciation of the art that both of you, present and work so hard to present out there. That's all I'm saying.
That's part of the.
Go ahead.
But yeah, reason why Photomoto has zillions of talks, because we at least we find it important, the public programming and discourse, which we feel is really lacking photography.
Yeah, it made it very strong show.
Medyo ironic ng konti nga kasi, for example, since Stephanie mentioned Photomoto, one of the strongest or loudest voices about not wanting his images explained is Ben. So Ben Molina. So Ben Molina is one of the exhibitors or featured artists in Photomoto. And I was having a conversation with him. I was saying na actually when you did your talk, you didn't say anything. Sabi niya, napansin mo rin. Kasi sabi ko, kasi parang I wrote about it na yun the foolishness of trying to explain a photograph. But I was writing it in the perspective of Ben. So I don't necessarily ascribe, kasi I think I don't want din naman na makuha yung idea na I believe that you should or you shouldn't write anything. So as somewhere in the middle, in a way parang most of the time I try to put myself as an outsider. I treat myself as an outsider. Kaya photography chismis in a way hindi mo siya makakawa na you're pro this, you're anti this. Kasi I'm intentionally trying to parang put myself parang as in the perspective of an outsider, that for example, if someone like Ben Molina would say that parang they were even parang joking about it, si Derek Soriano is also a photojournalist na parang he was saying na parang ba't kailangan explain para ba yan sa ginabi ng uwi, kailangan magpaliwanag sa asawa. As in, they were putting it na parang gano'n na sarcastic and derisive na nakakatawa na hurtful for people who try to explain their work. So, pero in a way, parang sige, if this is the case, that there's a certain part of the community that thinks that photographs shouldn't be explained, then I'll give them the floor. So, that's why I wrote about them. Tapos, siguro, you mentioned also, Angela, the street photographers. Actually, one of the groups, I mean, two groups specifically, they're composed of a lot of street photographers. They're actually the group that is saying, no, don't put any caption. And it's interesting because for them, as mentioned by Steph, similar yung thinking nila kay Jerry na once I say something about it, whether it be even kahit na title lang or putting parang sabihin natin binondo. So yung binondo parang that's neutral. That's a neutral word or a neutral statement in the sense that you're not saying anything. You're just saying that this is the place where it was taken. For some street photographers, even that you shouldn't put, because for them, the form is the content. It's the experience itself. The word is extraneous. It's something that is yeah, so the image should be demonstrative of what they wanted to say, and the demonstration is not necessarily an explication of an idea, but an experience of a visual phenomena. Parang ganun siguro yung thinking nila, na parang even, for example, kasi that's all, I'm part of that. Parang minsan kati-kati ako, kahit can I even say lang yung yung title lang. No, kasi yun that's they chose to, because that's how they choose to, for their images to be consumed. And siguro parang to siguro to encapsulate lang din yung stand ko. I think the good the question of putting a text, where regardless of the context, it points back to the agency that is has control of that image, in the sense that if that image is put in the context of a gallery, the power to put or not put a text is primarily dalawa yan. So the artist, if he decides na I don't want to make an artist statement, so he has that option. But the curator, if he said no, sige, I won't ask you to do an artist statement, but I need to put, kasi it's going to be consumed. So the goal of the gallery or me as a curator is to make a statement about this. So if that curator decides that I need to create text, then that's the agency of the curator or the curatorial body to put a text. So basically, parang ang nangyari, the choices, whether to put a text or not, it points back to a form of agency that affects or relates to the image. Now, for example, even sa social media, let's say, even if an image is devoid of any textual content, if someone puts a label on it, that's his agency trying to impose a certain reading of that image based on that. Kasi even, for example, let's say the curator and the artist decided, even nagkaroon na ng even sabihin natin, Angela, in your case, sabihin natin, you explained, you had a curatorial text, you even had an artist talk, and then a reader and a viewer says, Angela, I don't think that I think your work means this. In a way, parang it's it's part of that postmodernist condition that yun yung pinag-usapan din namin kanina nung simula, na parang in a way, parang ngayon it's the death of the photographer, it's the death of the artist. I think Roland Barthes also wrote about that in ngayon sa situation from 1950s onwards, parang parang yung power ng artist, parang medyo namatay ang artist, in the sense that when you put a work out there, whether you're an author, a writer, a musician, any creative agent, once a product is out in the world, you've already gave a body to it. It becomes an entity in itself. Anyone can read it the way they want. Now, for example, parang you were talking about the Philippine flag, and then someone says na it's about patriarchy. Parang, wait lang, it's a Philippine flag, relax. No, because it's patriarchy. It's a symbol of colonization. Then we're perpetuating the idea of colonization up to 2023 because we're using the flag that was a response of the Aguinaldo government to the Spanish colonial government, and however they did not revolt. They actually accepted the parang ang dami, parang in a way, parang, pero that's an extreme case. So yun. So I guess yun lang siguro. I always end up with parang a context, parang, so are we talking about it as an exhibition? Are we talking about it as a monograph? Are we talking about it in class? Oh, ba nasagot ko, no? Sorry, Angela. So
No.
Yeah.
It was very interesting to get your perspectives, because it becomes, I think, a collaborative project between the curator, the artist, the gallery, to decide on what the overall exhibition will or won't include. And I'm fine with that. It's just that I am so personally willing to work so hard to release my work into the public, knowing that it could be taken in so many different ways that I absolutely have no control over. And that's fine with me. But until then, I want to support my work with as much as I can, you know. So thank you for the perspectives on from Anthony and from Stephanie, you know.
That even puts a burden on remember Jess, he's advocating for visual literacy as I am. Actually, that point puts a burden on the idea of visual literacy, because if that is the case, then what legitimizes visual literacy? If you say visual literacy, in a way, parang you're saying that there's parang a more valid way of reading an image. However, if pag merong isang pilosopo, not pilosopo, someone na lang, if someone who is more progressive, even the political terms, if there's someone who is a little bit more progressive and then believes on the postmodernist ideals, he would say that Jess and Tony, what you're saying about visual literacy cannot be legitimized by any existing meta narrative. You're trying to say that there's only one way, or at least sabi natin kahit na 10 ways of reading it, when in fact there's 1,000 ways of reading it. So parang that becomes parang a burden for advocates of visual literacy din. So that goes beyond artistic readings. So kaya ang hirap ng democracy talaga, pero it is what it is. So
yeah, there's also this burden of navigating what the artist wants. I was just working with an artist who, she did not want any statement at all. She wanted a poem because her work was very political. And I tried to convince her, but she just really wanted to put a poem. And in the end, I mean, I think the artist, it's her show, it's her say. So even in writing, we have to be very careful to never misquote the artist in a way. So there is a balance of what does the artist want? What is their intention? Am I gonna force something or no? Those many factors come into play. It's really tricky.
and I guess from both of you, I really like yung emphasis of given that we cannot legitimize any any totalizing idea of what should and should not. If that is the case, the way out, or hindi naman the way out, the way that we navigate it is through conversations. Na parang, sige, let's talk about it. So, in a way, parang it's a give and take na, sige, if we're saying that there's 1,000 ways of reading it, for the two of us, as an artist and as a curator, or sabihin natin, in my case, as a estudyante ko, as a teacher and a student, then let's have this conversation. And at least from the 1,000 ways of reading it, then we narrow it down to two, your perspective and my perspective. And at least it becomes productive. It doesn't need to be nebulous na parang we're talking about the flag and you're talking about feminism. Could be, diba? I mean, that's an option. I mean, it could be a trajectory of a conversation that the Philippine flag is a symbol of patriarchy. You know, that's valid, diba? Pero yun nga, so in the case of that situation, that every voice is valid and everyone wants to be heard, then sige, let's have a conversation. And that's the point of this one, the counterpoints. So I think this is new rin, parang wala ko nakitang parang episode na ganito na parang, sige, you want to say something, you want to add or a commentary, then let's hear your thoughts. Okay, with that, galing ba ng ending ko? Galing na segue ko. So with that, any other questions? And then siguro kung wala, then I'll let Steph have a closing word, since this is your program in a way. This is your episode.
Thanks for joining us. I don't think I have anything more to add, but I would try to encourage the audience to continue listening in to Anthony's series, which apparently is already going to be every single weekend. And I'm going to be in one that is further out about sustainable photography.
Yun. So, Steph, thank you. Thank you for joining. Thank you for this conversation. Yun. Meaningful conversations about Philippine photography. That's the goal of Photography Chismis and this Marites Talks series. So, and also thank you for our audience. So, specifically si Angela who opened that question about text and the photograph. So with that, so thank you everyone. So if obviously you're viewing this as a recorded recorded material. So we invite you to see to go to Photography Chismis Facebook page for the other content that we have aside from the podcast. We have some textual analysis, and then you go to Spotify, and that's the podcast format. So with that, so thank you, and till the next episode. Bye.
I
Bye.